November 23rd, 1962. The morning after Thanksgiving, a quiet street on the north side of Youngstown, Ohio. A 60-year-old man in a warm coat walked out of his house with his two boys, Tommy, 11 years old, and Charlie Jr., 12. He was driving them to football practice. The turkey was still in the icebox. The car in the driveway wasn't even the Cadillac he was famous for, just a plain 1956 Ford sedan, the family runabout. Tommy climbed in with his father. Charlie Jr. lagged behind on the walk, 12 years old, dawdling the way 12-year-olds do, a few steps short of the car door. His father turned the key. The Ford erupted. The blast killed Charles' Cadillac Charlie Cavallaro instantly. It killed Tommy, 11 years old, on his way to football practice the morning after Thanksgiving. And it threw Charlie Jr., saved by those few dawdling steps, into a hospital bed for 86 days, his hip so shattered that surgeons worked on him for 5 hours just to give him a future. Somebody had wired dynamite to the ignition of a family car on a residential street in the United States of America, knowing that man drove his children in it. And here is the detail that will stay with you long after this video ends. When cars exploded in this town, and they exploded again and again and again, the people of Youngstown had a nickname for it. They called it a Youngstown tune-up. 82 bombings in and around one city spanning a decade. Not one of them ever solved, not one conviction. A body count that climbed year after year while the police shrugged, the courts blinked, and the town made jokes. 4 months after Tommy Cavallaro was buried, the Saturday Evening Post put this city on newsstands across America under a headline that became its second name, Crimetown, USA. And the sub-headline was even colder than the story. Youngstown has had 75 bombings and 11 killings in a decade, and no one seems to care. This wasn't Chicago, this wasn't New York. This was a mid-sized steel town of strivers and churchgoers, halfway between Cleveland and Pittsburgh, and for most of a century, it was the most reliably corrupt city in the United States. A city where the mafia didn't whisper, it detonated. Where car bombs functioned as press releases. Where the mob shot a county prosecutor in his own kitchen on Christmas Eve. Where a sitting United States congressman was tangled with the rackets for decades. And where, by the count of a national investigation, more than 70 public officials and mob figures were eventually convicted in a single federal reckoning. This is the story of how one ordinary American city became Bomb City, USA. How 2 out-of-town mafia families turned a Steel Valley into a demilitarized zone and used dynamite as their official language. And how the murder of an 11-year-old boy brought the FBI down on the town and still changed almost nothing for 30 more years. But here's the twist that explains everything. The fact almost nobody outside the Mahoning Valley understands. Youngstown was never ruled by a mafia family. That's the secret. Chicago had the outfit. New York had 5 families. Youngstown had nobody, no boss, no throne, no local government of crime. It was open territory, claimed by 2 empires at once, Cleveland on one side and Pittsburgh on the other, and that is exactly why it burned. Stay with me, because once you understand why the bombs went off in Youngstown, you'll understand something true about every borderland in the world. To understand Bomb City, you have to understand what Youngstown was before the dynamite. Steel. The Mahoning Valley was one of the great furnaces of America mills, running day and night, chimneys staining the sky, and wave after wave of immigrant labor pouring in to feed them. Italians, Slovaks, Greeks, Irish, black families, up from the south. Tens of thousands of men doing brutal shift work for cash wages. And wherever there are cash wages and long odds, there is gambling. Youngstown's game was the bug, the neighborhood numbers lottery. Pick 3 digits, bet a penny, a nickel, a dime, dream all day. Here's how the business actually worked, because the economics explain the war. The bug paid out around 600 to 1 on a bet whose true odds were 1,000 to 1. That spread that gap between real odds and paid odds was a 40% house edge, collected penny by penny from every mill worker, every barber shop, every corner store in the valley, every single day. Individually, nothing. Multiplied across a whole industrial valley, the bug was a machine that turned pocket change into millions a year, tax-free. By 1950, the Youngstown rackets, the bug, the betting parlors, the after-hours joints had mushroomed into a multi-million-dollar industry. And that kind of money does not go unclaimed. The problem was geography. Youngstown sits almost exactly between two mafia capitals, an hour or so from Cleveland, an hour or so from Pittsburgh. Both families looked at the valley and saw the same unclaimed treasury. Neither could take it outright without war against the other. So the national syndicate never seated a family there. No boss, no commission seat, no local authority to keep order. Instead, Youngstown became something far more dangerous than a mob town. It became a frontier. Local racket men ran their own operations and paid tribute, some up the road to Cleveland, some down the road to Pittsburgh. Every operator was a vassal of a distant empire. And when a dispute broke out over territory, over tribute, over a partner switching sides, there was no boss to hold a sit-down. There was no court of appeal. There was only the message. And in Youngstown, the message came wired to a starter motor. You have to understand why the car bomb, specifically, became the local instrument. A shooting kills a man. A bomb makes an announcement. It requires no witnesses, leaves almost no evidence. In 1950s, forensics, and in coal and quarry country where dynamite moved freely, it was cheap and available. It told the victim's allies in one blast heard for blocks, your side lost this argument. The bomb wasn't just a murder weapon. It was the inter-office memo between two corporations headquartered in other cities. In Youngstown, they called it a tune-up. Now meet the men the memos were addressed to. Through the 1950s, the two biggest local powers in the bug were partners turned enemies. Vince De Niro, a sharp-dressed rackets boss who ran his empire out of an uptown restaurant, and the Naples brothers, Sandy, Billy, Jimmy, and Joey, a family operation with muscle to spare. De Niro and Sandy Naples had once been partners. Then the money got big, the partnership curdled, and each side lined up behind one of the distant empires, one leaning on Pittsburgh's protection, the other on Cleveland's. What followed was not a war the way Chicago fought wars, with armies and truces. It was slower and colder, a decade of tit-for-tat messages. In March of 1960, Sandy Naples was shot down at night, alongside his girlfriend on her front porch. No arrests. In July of 1961, his brother Billy Naples was killed by a bomb, one more tune-up on the ledger. No arrests. And 2 weeks after Billy died, the answer came back. On July 17, 1961, Vince De Niro, 39 years old, the Uptown King himself, got into his car. The ignition was wired. The explosion was so enormous, it shattered the plate glass windows of 20 businesses around him and shook houses for blocks. By the accounts that later surfaced, the surviving Naples brothers had reached out of state to arrange it, hiring the job done out of Canton, Ohio. Charged with the murder, no one. Solved, never. Two rackets kings and a bomb war in the middle of an American downtown, and the official record says, to this day, that nobody did it. But that's not the crazy part. The crazy part is the silence around the blasts. 82 bombings, remember houses, cars, clubs, storefronts, across a decade. And the town absorbed them like weather. Police solved none of them. Local prosecutors convicted no one, because the rot wasn't just in the rackets, it was in the offices that were supposed to fight the rackets. The bug couldn't operate at industrial scale without protection, and protection in the Mahoning Valley was a line item. Police looking away, officials on retainer, investigations that evaporated. The bombs kept the underworld in line, and the payroll kept the overworld quiet. The system worked perfectly, until the morning it killed a child. Cadillac Charlie Cavallaro was old Youngstown, a made man with connections reaching New York, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland, a veteran of the racket since Prohibition days, officially listed as a grape salesman. A grape salesman, that was the joke he told the taxman. By late 1962, in the shifting alliances after the De Niro and Naples killings, Cavallaro was on somebody's ledger. Exactly whose and exactly why is still argued about 6 decades later, because this murder, like all the others, was never solved. What is documented is the morning, the day after Thanksgiving, the 1956 Ford. Football practice, Tommy in the car, Charlie Jr. a few steps behind. The key. Whoever built that bomb knew Cadillac. Charlie drove his boys in that Ford and wired it anyway. 11-year-old Tommy Cavallaro became, by the local record, the first child ever killed in the town's bombing wars the morning the message system finally wrote a message no one could ignore. The blast that killed a 60-year-old racketeer made the town shrug one more time. The death of his son detonated everything else. Federal law enforcement descended on Youngstown in numbers. The valley had never seen more agents, by the local accounting, than any bombing had ever drawn. 4 months later, in March of 1963, the Saturday Evening Post published John Kobler's investigation, and Kobler was no tabloid stringer. This was the man who would write the definitive biography of Al Capone. His verdict christened the city Crime Town, USA, and his numbers stunned the country. 75 bombings, 11 killings, 1 decade, 0 justice, and no one seems to care. Youngstown was now nationally famous for exactly one thing, and here is the bleakest fact in this entire story. Even then, even with a dead child, a federal invasion, and a national scandal, no one was ever convicted for the Cavallaro bombing. Not for Tommy, not for De Niro, not for the Naples brothers. The wave receded, the agents moved on, the bug kept paying 600 to 1, the town kept voting for the same officials, and the tune-ups continued, on and off, for another generation. Here's where it gets interesting, because most crime stories end when the smoke clears, and Youngstown's just kept going. In September of 1977, on a day the valley still calls Black Monday, the steel industry began its collapse mills closing, tens of thousands of jobs evaporating, the city's population starting a free fall from a peak near 170,000 toward a fraction of that. The legitimate economy died, the illegitimate one did not. The Cleveland-Pittsburgh tug-of-war rolled right through the wreckage through the 1980s, when a local mob middleman named Charlie Carabia vanished in December of 1980 and was never found, leaving behind secret tapes that would haunt the valley's politics for years. Through 1991, when Joey Naples, the last of the 4 Rackets brothers, 30 years after Billy and Sandy went into the ground, was shot dead near the house he was building. Still the same war. Still, the same 2 distant empires. And then came Christmas Eve, 1996, the night Youngstown proved that nothing, in over half a century, had changed. Paul Gaines was a former cop who had just won the election for Mahoning County prosecutor without the mob's permission. The Valley's rackets boss of that era, Lenny Strollo, had enjoyed what federal prosecutors later described plainly in court, an arrangement with the prior prosecutor's office. Cases could be managed. Problems could be fixed. Gaines hadn't been elected yet for a single day of work, and he was already unacceptable because he wouldn't play, so Strollo ordered him killed before he could take office. On December 24th, 1996, a hired gunman named Mark Batcho slipped into Gaines's home and shot him in his own kitchen on Christmas Eve. Gaines went down, critically wounded. And then the hit fell apart by the accounts that came out in court. The weapon failed before the job could be finished. The crew botched its own escape, and Paul Gaines survived. Read that again. In the 1990s, the era of the internet and the minivan, the Mafia attempted to assassinate an incoming American county prosecutor in his kitchen on Christmas Eve for the crime of winning an election. Youngstown in 1962 and Youngstown in 1996 were the same city. Only the cars had changed. But the kitchen on Christmas Eve was the last message Bomb City ever got to send, because this time the man survived, and this time the federal government didn't recede. The investigation that grew out of the Gaines shooting and the Strollo rackets cracked the valley open like nothing since the Cavallaro bomb. Lenny Strollo himself, cornered, did what Youngstown bosses had never done. He flipped and started naming every judge, cop, and official the rackets had ever owned. The sweep that followed was biblical. By the count of the New Republic's investigation into the valley, an exposé fittingly titled Crime Town, USA. More than 70 officials and mob figures were convicted, a roll call that reached prosecutors, police, judges, and beyond. And at the very top of the wreckage stood the valley's most famous son, Congressman Jim Traficant, the wild-haired populist who had first beaten a bribery case back in 1983 as sheriff, accused of taking mob money, defending himself in court without a lawyer, and walking. In 2002, the government finally made its case. Trafficant was convicted of bribery and racketeering, and the House of Representatives expelled him, only the second congressman expelled since the Civil War. And if you watch this channel, you already know the first. Ozzie Myers, the man from our abscam story, stuffing envelopes into his suit pocket on FBI film. American political corruption is a small world. Youngstown was its capital. So what happened to everyone else? Charlie Cavallaro Jr., the 12-year-old saved by a few dawdling steps, survived his 86 days in the hospital, grew up, grew old, and 6 decades later was still standing up at community events in Youngstown to tell the story of the morning his father turned the key, so that, in his words, it wouldn't be forgotten. He is the last living witness of Bomb City's worst morning. Paul Gaines recovered from his Christmas Eve wounds, took the oath of office, and served as Mahoning County prosecutor for 26 years, the job the mob shot him to keep him from starting before retiring in 2022. The men behind his shooting went to prison. His would-be assassin drew an 18-year sentence, and Lenny Strollo, the last real boss of the Valley's rackets, ended his career as a government witness, the final proof that even in Youngstown, the code eventually died. Jim Trafficant served his time, came home to the Valley that still loved him, and died in 2014 after an accident on his family farm. And the city itself, the city is the final casualty list. The mills never came back. The population never came back. Whole neighborhoods of Bomb City went back to grass and empty lots, including corners where the bombs once shattered 20 storefronts at a stroke. 82 bombings, and you can stand today where most of them went off and hear nothing but wind.